is Behind the Games from newoverlords.com, where we seek creators of all kinds to find out what's behind our favorite games. With your hosts, Jeff and Seema.
This is New Overlords Behind the Games podcast, and from the greater Chicagoland area, I'm Jeff Lamech.
And from our Northeast studio, I'm Seema.
Today, we're joined by Marcel Smorszczewski, founder of Orion Games, which is an indie studio working on a very cool and artistic game that we'll be talking about called Arto. Marcel, hello.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I saw Arto. I saw a couple trailers for it. I actually saw a press release on it. And the first thing that struck me, which catches my eye for a lot of games, which you would expect, was the art style. And then I started looking closer, and I said, art style. I mean art styles. And then I realized, and after talking to you, there's actually 6 art styles is the way this game is put together. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and how it sort of works, but really creative in that way. And then I looked into the studio background, Orion Games, and your background and your journey, and putting a lot of really talented people together, but newer to the games industry, and putting these new ideas into a game. It looks really, really exciting. It's great to see fresh ideas coming into the gaming space, and the way things are coming together for Arto, I think it's going to be something that moves games forward. So I'm really excited to talk about it. So with that, why don't you describe Arto the game? And we'll take it apart. We'll talk about some of the mechanics and some of how it works first. And then, later in the show, we'll get into the origin story in the background and how you found publishers and things like that.
Of course. So just to kind of start with maybe a brief overview to paint a picture, which is a funny choice of words, given what the game is. Arto is a top-down action-adventure game. Its primary inspirations are games such as Hyper Light Drifter and Bastion when it comes to having a strong visual style as well as the core gameplay loop. In Arto, you play as Liv. She's an apostle to the god of color, which, again, our entire game is about art styles, as the name implies. And you're set on a mission to restore color, balance, and life to a world that's fractured and that's split into multiple different art styles. As you progress through this open world and you do side quests and main story missions, you start to uncover kind of the deeper layers and a more profound truth about what actually caused this fracturing called the chromaclism and your place in it. You color in these art styles, but you also have a lot of enemies that you have to combat. You do that through using an arsenal of different weapons that you can upgrade, as well as the ability to craft your own spells, of which there's a possible combination of over 80. So that's the general pitch for our very, very exciting single-player game.
Yeah, the idea of the monochromatic world and bringing color to it, that I think is the key visual. Well, that plus there being 6 art styles, I think is the key visual catch, the key visual hook. I love the kind of the lore. Was it chromaclism? What was
chromaclism,
yeah. I love the word chromaclism. That's
a great word. So having that kind of story and behind it, I think is going to give some extra power to it. But this idea of coloring in the world as you go and going into these different, instead of a biome, in this different art style internal world of the game is really visually appealing to me. But I've got to think it's got to be kind of difficult. I mean, if I was going to be making a game or getting an art style together, just getting one cohesive style alone seems like a fine challenge. What did you need to go through to get 6? And I mean, I know you have some good partners that are artists as well. How are you sort of coming up with the 6 styles? And then what's it like to actually put the mechanics into each of those 6 styles?
Naturally. So obviously, we have 6 different art styles, but we have to keep them cohesive. Our initial philosophy, and something that we kind of kept in the forefront even of our documentation, GDD, was to always make a game that someone is playing on whatever machine, being a PC or a Switch, big screens, small screens. People who would pass behind that person could spot our game with a corner of their eye and say, oh, that's Arto. It's that unique game. And so having that philosophy combined with this idea of coloring in the world and having multiple art styles really helped us set several rules down in place that helped us develop those art styles. It was definitely a very iterative process, and we spent way too long in pre-production working on them. I think the results show it. So essentially, the idea is for any player who sees our game or who plays our game to understand that despite it being 6 different art styles, the gameplay loop is still the same. So we had to make sure that each art style supports our unique gameplay loop. An example of an art style that we worked on in the past, which ended up being cut entirely from the game, is surrealism, where the camera would actually shift back. It wouldn't be top-down anymore. And as you approached objects, they would morph into different shapes. So something that looked like a rock from a distance could turn into a door that you can pass through. But because of that change in camera perspective, which was necessary for this effect to occur and to be fun to the player, our gameplay loop changed significantly, which caused us to cut it out. And so the most important thing for us was to keep the gameplay consistent, develop the gameplay just in a test arena, make sure that all the core gameplay loops work, and then try to design the art styles to be as visually distinct from one another whilst supporting our type of gameplay. So for example, since our gameplay loop doesn't have any jumping, we had to make sure that no art styles rely on, for example, very heavy shadows, because that typically in game leads to jumping and things of that nature. And so we also had to scrap one idea just because of that. As for the 6 art styles, maybe I shouldn't say that, but they're all actually very similar if you take away all of our shader work, as well as all of our different types of textures that we apply. Because the poly count in most of the objects in the game is pretty consistent. If one tree in one art style is comprised of some number X of tries, a tree in a different art style, which is colored completely differently in texture, then one might be dripping paint and the other one might be just a few cubes floating around. At the end of the day, they're both in a similar poly range because we realize that helps players keep things consistent in their mind as they're playing the game. So we really wanted to maintain a similar level of visual clarity between those different art styles, which again proved to be quite a challenge because it was a very limiting thing that we had to implement. So for example, our art styles very heavily rely on something like a screen filter, where each one has a very, very custom and unique screen filter which makes that certain biome, that certain arto, look painted or look like it's rendered on a 16-bit television or with some noise and things like that. So that's, for example, one of the tools that we used.
So a lot of like a post-processing layer.
We actually have several post-processing layers working together. But again, we had to define each art style initially, and there are still some tricks before all this post-processing comes in.
That's interesting. I like the idea of this concept of, and you can definitely see it as you look at the trailers, of being able to look at the game, no matter which of the art styles you happen to be playing in at the moment, and still recognize it as Arto in the game. And I think that does come through.
And for me as a player, I'm sitting here thinking, when you change the art style, that's such a major change. To have the gameplay loop be consistent is something for me to hold on to.
So again, it's trying to keep it consistent, but then also trying to keep it fresh and at the same time a little bit different. So it's a little bit oxymoronic what we're trying to accomplish here. But
I think you do achieve it. And as I said, even just looking through the trailer content, each of the biomes, I don't know why I keep calling it, each of the artos, is that what you're calling sort of each of the artos does connect visually. And even though the styles are very distinct, and there's impressionist, there's sort of like cell shading, there's almost pixel,
16-bit sort of era. Yeah, it's our love letter to the 16-bit era, really,
which looks super cool and comes across really well, especially as the monochromatic, like the spray of colored pixels goes out into the world ahead of the character as you play through. That is visually very distinct, but those motions of the main character, those attack moves, the arrangement of the way the screen is set up, that definitely is very consistent. And I think you're right. I think people will be able to just walk by whatever happens to be going on at the time, whichever Arto you happen to be in, and be able to still recognize the game. That's clever. That's probably a huge challenge. One of the other things I think you mentioned when we were talking about this was some of the sacrifices you had to make in what you had maybe wanted to do with the UI. Because changing the art style or rearranging the UI from Arto to Arto could be really disruptive to the player.
Definitely. So one of our challenges that we overcame pretty early, we set a rule for ourselves, was to have the transitions from one art style to another happen without a load screen. Because that also helps the player kind of stay immersed in this world, and not if you're running, you run into an invisible wall or in some arbitrary cave or something, and we have a long load screen while we load all the new assets. And we really tried to keep the player, as I mentioned, immersed. And one of the ways in which we hoped to do that was to change the UI depending on which art style you were in. So that would be things like health bars, your currency indicator, your resource bar, your paint bar. And we realized that, first of all, it was a huge commitment in terms of just 2D assets and memory. We had to work on different pictures of the health bars. We had to make sure that they translate very nicely. If we're using, let's say, little bars in one art style, but then the other one is so high energy and 16-bit, maybe we should do vertical bars like in Mega Man. Then the players would get confused and be like, where's my health bar? I'm so used to looking here in this particular spot of the screen, and it's always a circle that goes from up to down, or in the upper left corner, it's always a bar. Why is it changing? So we decided to scrap all of that. But then it also made us think, okay, since the health bars are a representation of our protagonist, and they aren't changing from art style to art style, we want to keep it kind of cohesive and also have her not change, which again proved to be quite a big challenge for us. So even though we had one limitation, right, with the health bars, we decided to adapt. It caused another limitation for us, and we had to work again with some of our post-processing and, for example, make our player be not affected by most lights in the game. Because if she enters a highly purple art style or a very dark and dim art style, we still need her white jacket to be recognizable and not absorb any light and kind of cast her own glow. And so that again led to a lot of challenges of keeping her consistent throughout those ever-changing art styles and make her not stick out like a 3D character in a 2D game. So that again led to a lot of experimentations with shaders and things of that nature.
This again sounds like a really important design decision. When I'm thinking about user interfaces and user interfaces that are really usable in a lot of different games, the user interface becomes part of your peripheral vision. And you do rely on just a very consistent understanding of which user interface elements are doing what's an alert that you need to pay attention to and what's an alert that you don't need to pay attention to, health bars, where they're at in your peripheral vision. And to have to reset that or readjust as a player every time and have that changing all over the place, that would be pretty disruptive, because that's not the game. You know, the user interface is what informs the game, but you know, you've got these monsters and creatures coming at you, and you know, you're fighting them and you're dodging, and that's where you need to be focused on. And I think in the same way, your character becomes part of your peripheral vision as well. You're not staring at your character the whole time. You're staring at what your character's about to do. You're staring ahead of your character and where you're fighting, where your abilities are headed, what you need to dodge, what you need to dance around. So that again seems like a great design principle to say, let's keep the character consistent, let's keep the peripherals consistent, so that when we are changing the things that are interesting, it's things that the player would expect to change. You're going to have a new creature or a new boss to fight. It's going to be a different boss in even a game that has a very consistent art style, and you expect it to be different. You're not fighting the same model of anything every time. So the fact that then that's where the different styles are represented, I think makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And we're just trying to prevent information overload for the player when they're playing. Exactly. Because it is a fast-paced action game at the end of the day. So the player doesn't really have time to, look for the new health bar. And
now you said all of the abilities and the mix of abilities and the potential for mix and match up to 80 different spells. Are all of those abilities and those ability effects, are those changing from art style to art style?
So they're not changing from art style to art style because, again, we made this decision to keep things unique to the player consistent.
Good.
But
I was going to say,
we did have, because then that would be like over 500 different renderings, and it would just be complete bloat in terms of scope of work, as well as just debugging later down the line and memory. But what we decided to do is for each spell to feel and look very, very different. So it's always recognizable what's happening. The way the player crafts their spells, which, by the way, the spells also color in the world, which was quite a challenge to make them do that because you're spraying paint, it would only make sense, is that we have various gates that govern the behavior of your spell. One gate can, for example, govern its shape. Is it a projectile, or is it a cone sort of spread, or is it some sort of different AoE? And another one can govern how it's cast. Is it an instantaneous cast, or do you have to channel it for a stronger effect? Or do you set a trap that activates when enemies are near? And it kind of goes on. We have 5 different gates that govern things like damage and lifetime of the spell. And each sort of choice is coded in some way. So, for example, this particular gate, let's say the damage gate, will change the spell from being yellow to blue to green or whatever. And then another gate will change the spell's trail. So the particle that's flying will be yellow, green, or blue, but perhaps the trail will have extra white tendrils behind it because the spell will be chaining from enemy to enemy. And so we also try to keep that artistic uniqueness to every single spell that's ever present in our game, but also to keep things very, very consistent for the player so that they don't have to think what the spell will do, even if they forgot what they did when they cast it. But just the visuals, each certain element of a spell will be easy to understand and digest for the player.
Got it. Now, that's not to say if the spells themselves and the effects of the spells are consistent, that's not to say what they do to the world is consistent, because that definitely changes. The splashes of colors and the way the color flows out. And
exactly.
That's very tied into the style in a cool way.
Again, from kind of like a behind the scenes view, and in some of the art styles, for example, what we do when we cast a spell is we reveal some masks on the surface of the world to then color in various things that the spells fly over. For example, in our 16-bit region, which is called Synthwave, where we have those pixels that color in as you're experiencing. There are actually no pixels. The world is always colored in. There's just this layer of gray above the player, comprised of hundreds upon hundreds of little squares. When we cast that spell, we kind of see what squares it flies under, and then we disable those squares so it looks like you're pixel coloring in the world rather than just spraying paint into it. So again, we tried to, despite having the same spell, have it interact with the world differently depending on which Arto you're in.
I wonder if, because you all are relatively new to making games, if you're breaking a bunch of rules. I mean, do you know? It sounds like you might be, but inventing new ways to represent this stuff visually and have these kinds of effects. It sounds like you're taking some leaps that are really paying off in terms of what you're visually creating as a result.
We hope so, but the fact that most of the team is still new to the industry, we do have 1 or 2 veterans, but for us, it's the first game we're working on. It's both a blessing and a curse. We're still learning, so we're actually using a lot of basic tools that are available with our engine, Unity, and we're just trying to combine different systems that Unity has in it to achieve this unique effect. Because again, if we were to spend a lot of time developing something new, that just wouldn't be the best use of our resources because we're still so inexperienced. But we're essentially trying to create something new with already the tools that we have in our toy box.
I think you're going about it the right way, though, which is going to the limits, going to the edges of what the tool and the platform makes available. Because if you stick to the core, you can tell a story, you can put together a good game. In fact, you can put together a great game, but it won't be visually distinct, which is the real hook of what Arto is going to bring. There's a lot of games now where you can just look at the game, you can look at 2 seconds of a trailer and say, oh, there's another Unreal Engine game, because just it looks like Unreal Engine, and it's very, very core to what you would expect from an Unreal Engine game. And there's games you can look at and say, oh, that's a Unity game, and however you look at Arto, and because it's stressing things to the limit, and it's putting multiple layers of different effects together and multiple different parts of the engine, and sort of, I would even imagine, stressing it or combining it in new ways, you do get something very visually distinct, which is the hook.
Definitely. And again, that was our priority. We didn't want our game to just look like just another game, as I mentioned earlier. And the fact that we were really trying to push ourselves with our decisions on how to model things, how to texture them, how to apply various different shaders. We wanted something that would just be visually distinct and bring something new to the industry. Because again, we're a first-time studio. We hope we'll be able to continue making games. But if this is the only one, we wanted to leave something that adds something new to this medium.
Now, visually distinct also, you talked one aspect of it, which was the abilities and being able to tell because of some of the way the ability looks and is colored and some of the aspects of it that you should remember how it was set up and be able to have triggers or some kind of affordance that allows the player to remember. I believe you've also done that with the effects of the enemy and how you're interacting with the enemies and the kinds of telegraphs for when you need to expect a block or when you can do extra damage and that kind of thing. Talk about that for a second. So sort of the visual design there too.
So again, for our enemies, despite it being different art styles, and in one art style you're fighting essentially a painted samurai demon who looks like he was painted 200 years ago, and in another art style you're fighting essentially a punk who just ripped off some car doors and is using that as a battering ram. He's chasing you around with. In both of those different scenarios, which are very, very visually distinct, we wanted the player to always understand what this enemy is doing. And so to that end, we set several rules again for ourselves. All of our enemies fall into certain different categories that we hope the player will be able to understand kind of intrinsically without really thinking too much about it. So you have the little enemies. They're always small on screen and they always look non-threatening. In our level that's inspired by pop art, you have little crabs. But in our vector cubism level, which is all very, very low poly, you have little ants. And they're different. Crab is different from an ant, and one has huge, thick outlines around it, and the other one is just comprised of triangles that are very big and visible. In both of those cases, we wanted to make sure that when the enemy approaches the player will automatically understand, oh, that's the type of enemy that wants to get close to you, takes a long time to charge up, and then does a weak attack. So it's enemies that we can mow down easily. Or we will always have an enemy with a shield. The shield will always be more or less the same size, no matter what the art style you're in, and the enemy will carry it in front of them. So we wanted to communicate that to the players so they understand that even though the art styles change, the rules are the same. If an enemy has a shield, you either have to parry him to break his stance, or you have to hit the shield enough times to just unbalance the enemy. So we set those rules for ourselves in terms of design and AI. But then also we realized that it's still not enough. Players still get lost because there's so much information that they get when art styles change and some of the rules are inconsistent. So we looked at other games and how they go about doing that. One thing that stuck out to us was in Sekiro, where an enemy does an unparryable attack, there is this huge flash of red above the enemy, which indicates, oh, it's this type of attack. And we looked at our attacks and we realized, okay, our attacks also come into categories, parryable and unparryable. And so every single enemy now will have a different flash of either a circle or an X rendered in a different art style depending on the enemy's art style. That will flash for every single one of their attacks. And we again hope that sort of little bit of information that the player gets will then tell them how to react to an enemy's attack. We're actually very pleasantly surprised because recently one of the best games to release last year, God of War, did something very, very similar where they would have blue, yellow, and red circles around enemies to indicate what sort of attack they're doing so the player knows how to react. So we're happy that we're following in some good footsteps there.
That's the kind of thing that even if you don't describe it, there's no instructions, you're not telling the player. It's the kind of thing that players intrinsically will pick up. It's, we are all deep learning, machine learning machines ourselves
Yes.
in our own brains. And being able to recognize that you may get through and complete the game and be able to ask a player, well, how did you know that was going to be an attack? They might not even know. I don't know. I just knew. Because you're providing that kind of visual affordance, that they're just going to intrinsically pick it up and be able to react.
This is the kind of thing that I think people are thinking when they say, oh, the gameplay was intuitive.
Right.
They don't know that they're figuring it out.
And
exactly.
The consistency of that intuition, being able to the players, whether they know it or not, be able to rely on that, I think is a big part of that as well. So those are great. As you describe them, as you're describing the rules you've made for yourself and how you sort of define that as rules, I think is a really good way from a game design perspective to to put that down and make sure that the design team then has something that they can anchor things around.
Precisely, because we want to make the game as fun as possible for the player. Every game designer, every game developer wants to make a fun game that people will enjoy. That's why we're in the gaming space. But again, we asked ourselves, what is fun? It's fun to play the game, not to be frustrated with, why did he attack me? What's going on?
Right. Now, fun, I watched your video. You have a great video on your YouTube channel where you go into some of the background and development of the game. And you say multiple times throughout that video, we went through this iteration of the game and it just didn't seem that fun. And then we went through the next iteration. So I'd love to know two things around that. One is that journey and how you sort of cranked it up and made it more fun for each of the iterations. I guess three things, or maybe four.
Oh boy, do I need a piece of paper?
I'll come back to it. But the main one is that. But the second one then is at each of those transition points when you're saying it just didn't seem that fun. How did you know? How did you determine? Was it just your team getting together, play testing yourselves? Was it did you bring it to players and have players play test it? How did you know? And then what were these tweaks that you made along the way?
Certainly. So maybe let me first start off by defining what we saw as fun in our game. We initially we were just making the game and we're like, okay, we need combat. Let's get a combat system going. Hyper Light Drifter has this amazing combat. Let's just try to get something similar in place and try to make it our own. Put a unique spin on it. And that's how we started off. And we would put together a build, with the character running and attacking and dodging and all of the basic mechanics. And we didn't even want to play it that much. We're like, yeah, we developed it, but we, the developers, are not enjoying the gameplay itself because we're also gamers. And that was kind of our first indication that what we have currently in our hands, that's still back in like 2019, 2020, it's just not fun because we're not getting any pleasure from playing it. And so then we kind of defined rules, try to really figure out what makes a game fun when it's like a combat game with a lot of dying and it's a reactive combat gameplay loop. And we realized that most games that we can look at from huge AAAs like Dark Souls or Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, all the way to the smallest indie games, which is just like 1 hour long or 2 hours long, they all basically give player fun in a few different ways. The first is moment-to-moment gameplay has to be fun. Here we're talking things like screen shakes, sound effects, visual effects. Is actually hitting an enemy or parrying or dodging done in a satisfying way.
Yeah.
Am I getting that little kick of adrenaline? The second one is what we define as mid-level fun. And that's things like, for example, in games like The Witcher, there's this new cool upgrade that we can get if we get another skill point or another 2 skill points. So I'm going to work towards that. Or it's basically seeing some progression in the skill tree they have to work towards. Or it's when in Hollow Knight, you see, there's this new charm that I can buy from this merchant, but I still need 100 geo or 200 geo. So I'm going to go fight some enemies. And just imagining this new ability and how you're going to use it, that's also fun. And we didn't have that. And then the third one that we realized is just this kind of overarching fun. Like there's a conflict set up at the beginning of the story. I want to see how it's resolved. And that's, for example, is most prevalent in games like The Last of Us, where you really, really want to know how it ends, what goes on. And just kind of thinking about that is fun. And we looked at our game and we're like, okay, we have none of that. So in each iteration, we would be focusing on something. For example, we'd really double down on dodging and add things like, if you do a perfect dodge, just at the right frame rate, we're going to slow down the game and like zoom in a little bit to make it a little bit more epic. And when we are swinging our sword, we're going to make sure that the VFX are not only pretty, but also they're not very obstructing. And they clearly indicate the damage ranges so that the player doesn't feel frustration. They'll be like, can I hit that enemy or not? I don't even know. I should have hit him, but I didn't, or vice versa. And we'd add sound effects and blood or paint splatters to enemies and all of that kind of stuff to make this combat feel very reactive. We also added the ability to parry and block enemies because we realized the game is more immersive. It feels more like you're inside the game if you can actually interact with enemies. They attack you,
right?
And instead of finishing their animation, you block them and you knock them back by parrying. We noticed that a lot of games who have that, people just enjoy it more. So we added all of that stuff and we were like, okay, so now if I fight this enemy with his AI, it's pretty fun, but I'm still not really feeling it. Why not? And we realized that our enemies are just too complicated. If you're fighting 6 enemies at the same time, you cannot have each one of them doing one of 6 different attacks because it's just too much information. There's no way to react to it.
Right.
And again, looking back at some of our inspirations, if we look at Bastion or more recently Hades, every enemy really has one attack that they do. And so we again simplify this so that the player would know if you see this enemy, you have to expect them to roll at you. So you'll have to get out of the way. Or if you see this enemy, they'll keep their distance and they'll always be sniping at you. They won't suddenly run up and try to melee you. And so again, that and really pigeonholing essentially every single one of our enemies made moment-to-moment fun. It was like, okay, it's satisfying to fight groups of enemies in different configurations. So what? I still don't feel like fighting them because I get nothing out of it. And then we made enemies drop currency. We made upgrades for our different weapons and for the character. We made every upgrade be fun, not like plus 5% damage, but like now if you do a perfect parry, you have the ability to execute a cool kick to counter enemies. Or now you have the ability to do a linked triple dash. Or if you dash after casting a spell, you might not incur the mana cost. Things like that to really make it something for the player to look forward to and have this power fantasy. And then that made it more fun. And then we tried to really polish up the story and make it understandable, but still with high stakes that players would want to see the ending. Yeah. And it was kind of this step-by-step iterative process of changing various things around the combat system and directly within it that led us to what we believe now is just a fun way of fighting enemies.
I have to say that's the most interesting and complete answer we've ever had to the question of what is fun.
Right. Right.
But again,
I mean, that's incredible. That's
game,
like a little masterclass right there, Marcel.
Thank you. But again, it's very different. If you look at a game like Mario, or maybe even Papers, Please, let's say, over there, that's not fun at all, right? Because you're not really fighting enemies. I guess in Mario jumping on Goombas. But again, it's different for every game. And most developers, every developer, I assume, goes through that sort of process to really try to surgically pinpoint what can make my game as fun as possible.
I think that framework, though, of thinking, even if you break it into 2 things, at the micro level and at the macro level, and just focus on those 2 layers. And I think the 3 makes more sense in most games cases as well. But the micro level, as you described, it needs to feel good. It needs to feel reactive from the moment to moment. In Mario, when I jump on Goomba, I need to feel it. You know, it needs to feel like I'm have control. And then at the macro level, I'm trying to complete a level and getting through that whole level, and maybe at the 3rd level, you know, saving the princess at the very end, getting through all the levels. Those 2 layers both need to feel satisfying. And in your case, as you're describing, I'm now applying that framework in my mind to all of these games that I play. And we play a lot of Star Wars: The Old Republic. At the micro level, fighting with a lightsaber needs to feel good. Those abilities need to feel really good. But why do we fight? Well, we're gaining currency and we're gaining armor and there's weapon drops and that kind of thing. That's interesting. And then at the top level, there's a story. There's chapters. There's what's happening in the galaxy, and we're either fighting against or fighting for the Empire. That kind of thing. So that framework of understanding each of those layers and understanding what you're trying to achieve and having a vision for it, I think is, as you're saying, Seema, is sort of like a masterclass of design of where you need to layer your fun. So that's a really interesting way to approach it. This also then speaks to, which I think we can get into. You mentioned some of this started back in 2019. You were way back then. You were putting some iterations together. You were putting your layers together. You were working out what your visual rules were going to be. How did that start? Let's start with you. How did you start in even getting into games? And was games something you were always going to be doing and building? And then how did this idea turn into Orion Games?
Definitely. So I've always been really into games. I think the very first game I remember playing was either Pokemon Yellow or Super Mario Bros. 2 on like an old Game Boy Color. And I don't know, I spent a lot of time in Warcraft 3, kind of playing with that engine, and then League of Legends and Skyrim and all of those sorts of things. And I've always had a very, very kind of warm feeling towards video games. I always enjoyed them and had a lot of fun. And in school, I kind of also enjoyed mathematics-related programs. I went to study physics, which was, I realized after my first year of physics, I hate physics. And after getting my bachelor's, I started working in a startup, and I realized, oh, hold on, startup life is kind of fun. Even though I was doing soldering, and later I got pushed out into the business side of things, I realized that the business side of starting a company and working with a small team of very, very passionate people is something that appeals to me very deeply. And so I decided to try to get a master's in that. I started studying business. And during my year of a master's program, I saw all those people around me starting like app businesses for fashion, or trying to set up shops that would sell cosmetics, or trying to do some very, very advanced science. And I was really questioning what I should do and what am I passionate about. And I came back to games. I loved games. I enjoyed making games in Scratch way back when. And so I was just like, let's go for it. If I'm so passionate about games, I'm so passionate about starting a company and trying to build something. If I feel that's my path, let's just do it in games, because I feel like that's something I can love and I can really give it my best and be very, very passionate about it.
Just start a company.
Let's just start a company.
Everybody's starting companies. We'll just start a company.
Exactly. Everyone's starting companies. So let me do it. And then I was like, okay, but how do I actually go about doing that? It's great that I have this idea, but how do I even execute it? And I just started thinking like, okay, let me make a game that I would want to play very much. Something that I would enjoy. I know I enjoy games like other people. I'm sure if I make something that I would love, other people would find it fun as well. And I started off just by myself, working on this after hours, after my classes were finished and I did all my homework. For sure I did it and didn't spend time playing video games. I just started learning Unity, trying to play around, making some small projects. And I started writing the story also for what would eventually become Arto. Published that story because on Amazon, and I got reviews from both of my grandparents, because I wanted to have a copyright, because that's what our professor told us is very, very important. And as I was playing around in Unity and putting some code together, I realized, okay, this has potential. I worked in a startup and I got some equity there that I could sell, get some money, and actually work with an artist on this. And around that time, I also decided to just register a company name. So I wouldn't be signing documents. My company would be signing documents, and it would all be a little bit more structured and professional. And it wouldn't be like just two blokes working on something in the garage. It would be the next Blizzard working in a garage, the next great big studio. And so I just registered a domain through some website, started Orion Games, and started working with a friend of a friend who had a degree in animation. And so we started putting together the art and the code together for our very first draft of Arto. Eventually, we got joined by one other programmer. And at this time, and again, I was full of delusion. Let me just write that at the beginning. Let me just state that outright. I had runway for 3 months, and I thought, okay, let's make a game in 3 months. No one's made a game in 3 months, except for some amazing Game Jam games that were done over the weekend. And in that time, we were working, and I just couldn't see like the future, because I was so invested in moment-to-moment development and getting up at 8 a.m., going to sleep at midnight after a full day of sitting in Unity. And that way passed a month, and then a month and a half, and I realized, hold on, this is the halfway mark. We gotta get something. We have to have something, because what's gonna happen if we don't have any money? You can only, if you can live off of cup ramen, but you can't live off of it if you can't even buy it. And so we very quickly cranked out a build that we thought would be a nice cohesive level with solid gameplay and this idea of coloring in the world. And we were very, very excited about all that. We sent it to every publisher we could find under the sun. We watched some GDC talks on YouTube, and we Googled like list of video game publishers. We compiled it all together and we applied, and we're like, okay, so who are we going to pick? Are we going to go with Team 17 or Devolver, or maybe even EA will pick us up for EA Origins? We're very, very
Sure.
excited. And then we literally heard from no one back except for 4 publishers who were very, very nice. I still remember the email I got from Chucklefish where they were basically just telling us like, keep trying, guys, but this is still a draft. We need something a little bit more advanced. And we realized, we kind of took a step back, and that's the first time when we realized this is just not fun. And it's like, no wonder those publishers don't want to work with us. This isn't fun. And that was really our first, we took a step back and we realized our game looks unique, but it doesn't look good. It just looks different. But just because something is different doesn't mean it's good. We have to make it both different and very, very pretty to look at, or very fun to look at. The gameplay, it's uninspired. We're looking at games from 4 or 5, Bastion, I think back then even 7 years ago, that came out so long ago, that have a much, much more solid gameplay loop. So no one will want to play our game. We can't just aim for the giants and try to kind of do something similar to them. We have to surpass them in some way and make it our own. And
so
that kind of became our vision.
When was that about where you started sending out all those letters?
So that was, I remember, that was in November of 2019. We registered the domain name Orion Games in September. And 2 months later in November, we sent out all of those emails to publishers. And we were like, okay, it says online that typically publishers respond within 2 to 4 weeks. So that's perfect. So we're going to also sign paperwork within 2 weeks with a publisher, and we're going to have lots of money to make the game. That was seriously our mentality. Yeah. We were so woefully unprepared. 5 years ago, I'd say we were sweet summer children, but I don't know if making Game of Thrones references is still in. And I remember as December came around, we looked at our bank account. We spent an extra $100, I remember that month, on some assets in Unity, some packs of flowers, as well as some sound effects. And we were basically out of money, and no publishers were interested in us. And that was a very, very dark moment. And I was thinking okay, so do we close down shop? Do we go deeper? Some people were already sending out their resumes. Because we had, everyone knew about the situation of the company. We were always very transparent with one another. And I remember playing this game over and over in Unity, just in the editor. I wasn't even making builds. And I was thinking, is this salvageable? We're on a sinking ship. Can we save it, or should we just give up and, do something else with our lives? The world won't end. But I still had this, this fire in me. I was I want to make this game. This can be salvaged. And so I made an even stupider decision than starting a company with money for 3 months. I took out a loan against my apartment. And yeah.
Again, not recommended.
Very much not recommended. Such a stupid decision. But anyway, here I was. I went to the bank. I took out this loan. And I was okay, now we have an extra 3 months of runway. Maybe 4 months. Maybe 4 months of runway, maybe 3, depending on how much money we manage to save. So we have to basically get more money within that time frame. We definitely won't be able to finish a game. And we again took a kind of step back, and we really thought about, okay, we're applying to publishers. What games do they publish? We looked at, all the biggest ones, the biggest indie publishers, and even the smaller ones. And we realized, okay, our game is nowhere near the quality any of what those publishers publish.
At this point, was it still just you and the friend of a friend animator, or did you have more people then?
We had, let's say, 3 people full-time, 1 person part-time.
Okay.
So it was the 2 of us. It was a person who's our technical artist right now and our art director, Stefan. And it was 1 programmer who was working with us part-time. And so we decided, okay, let's get that programmer on board. He was a much better coder than me. I only had 1 year's worth of experience in Unity by that point, even less. And that was a professional person. We're let's cut our timeline by a month to 3 months, work full time, really, really commit ourselves. And where can we get money? Because probably applying to a publisher, we just won't have enough time. Even if we applied today and we got in a month, would we even be able to sign all of our paperwork in 2 months?
Right.
And so we decided to shift our focus then from publishers and not apply to publishers, and focus on things like funds, VC funds, angel funds, private investors, people who put their money into video games or they just want to have a diversified portfolio.
Yeah.
And just as an example, I remember I drove a car for 5 hours to New York for this like meeting of dentists who invest in different weird things. And I pitched my game there to just a whole bunch of, well, essentially dentists, because they were investors. They were looking to make a fund together, and they were looking to have a diversified portfolio. So I just want to say, like, we shifted completely from applying to indie publishers to applying to completely different investors, just people who had money. In the meantime, we were really stripping down everything in our game and really trying to make it visually pretty and unique and distinctive and very, very fun to just play. And I remember we were in our last month, again, of our runway in March. And I was becoming very, very dejected. I was pitching every day. Like, I remember I was getting up sometimes at 3 or 4 a.m. to pitch for like Korean time zones. We did a lot of pitches there in Japanese time zones. And attending a lot of also video game events where we could also get some money from industry insiders, just like really, really focusing on that fundraising side of things. And I was feeling very, very dejected at that point. And I was just kind of scrolling through LinkedIn, seeing who else on LinkedIn has money that they invest into video games. And I came across a person that I met at that point, like 10 years earlier. When I was 16, I'm Polish. And everyone in Poland is very, very religious about Cyberpunk and Witcher 3 and CD Projekt Red. When I was 16, I managed to get an internship at CDPR when they were still working on Witcher 2. And I was in charge of like playtesting, and not in charge. I was part of the huge playtesting team. And it was a lot of fun because I was a kid and I got to play Witcher 2 before it came out.
CDPR?
At CDPR. Yeah. And it was awesome. It was a great experience. And I was sitting like next to me and was sitting one of the senior developers, senior programmers, working on Witcher 2. And then later he worked on Witcher 3. And after Witcher 3, he made his own video game studio. And I decided to reach out to him and I was like, hey, how did you manage to, start a studio, make a full game? Seems like you're in a similar spot to me, just with a lot more experience, obviously. And you were able to make it work. Do you have any tips or tricks? And he was like, well, obviously, the one thing that you need is money because you're running a startup. And he's like, do you have like a good investor who's like, you have some KPIs set up with them, some milestones, and they'll keep pouring money? And I was like, no, that's what we're looking for. And he was like, well, let me introduce you to my godfather because he's the first investor into CDPR before they were even making Witcher 1. And I was like, okay, thanks. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And we he very quickly just put us in front of his godfather, who's this very, very successful Polish businessman. And he listened to my pitch. I remember for like 10 minutes, I was showing him our deck and our game and our vision. And he basically told us, well, my godson played your game. He said it has potential. And I trust him on that stuff because he made a great game and his studio is very successful. So I finance some of your development. That's where we got our first injection of funds very randomly. And I do want to stress, like, for months now, I've been pitching at weird hours, constantly getting rejections, very rarely getting a second or third call. And here in the first call, he said, you know what? I'm in. Let's have a second call, hash out all the details, but I'm in. And it was such a shock. I remember I was not even able to celebrate it because I was just baffled. In coding, when you work every single day, you make a little bit of an improvement.
You're supposed to reject me, and
exactly.
I've done this 200 times now, and this is not the way this goes.
Yeah, I know how it goes.
And I was like,
right.
What are we cooking here? What's going on? It was just so bizarre to me to feel like I've ran an entire marathon in a split second, like I was teleported to the finish line.
But anybody that's hearing this story, and if you want to create a game company, I mean, it's easy to create a game. It's hard to create a game company. And you having an entrepreneurial background and understanding that you do need to have a company, and even understanding what the runway is for different amounts of funding and putting those finances together, and then going through this learning process of within the games industry, what is it like to talk to publishers? What is it like to talk to investors? What are other sources of funding? That's a huge part of it. And that's probably a much more difficult part of it for a lot of aspiring game developers and game companies than the creative part. Because you get a lot of creatives and you'll get a lot of technical people and coders that can do interesting things. So hearing about that and hearing about that roadmap of that you need to expect you're going to have that kind of rejection and the return rate. And there's a lot of games that are getting published out there. It can be difficult to get people's attention. So I think knowing that then this is part of the journey, while sounding difficult, is realistic. And I think that's important for people to hear about.
Yeah, and it's important not to get discouraged, right? Because you can always give up and then it's all over. But if you just keep trying, maybe eventually you'll get successful. And again, I do want to stress, for us, was a lot of hard work, sure, and was 200 pitches. But I do also want to stress, it was also luck at the end of the day that helped us out immensely.
Yep.
If I hadn't
right person at
met
the right
that
time.
guy 10 years ago, and he hadn't shown up on my LinkedIn, and if he hadn't offered, and if his godfather wasn't in a very good financial situation at that point when we had that call, again, there are so many ifs. So it's also very often down to luck. And I think realizing that also helps put things in perspective.
But you wouldn't have gotten that luck if you hadn't shown up again and again and again. It would have gone to someone else.
You make your own luck. And you made the connections. And that's another thing that people really need to understand, is getting out there, making the connections, connecting to more people in the games industry. It was a connection you had made 10 years ago, but it was a connection you had made. So it was luck that you made. It wasn't just a lightning bolt out of the blue.
Naturally. But again, that's also very, very difficult. I remember it was very stressful for me, especially at the beginning, doing those pitches. And I remember the very first time I was pitching Arto, I was actually doing it over Zoom. And I had like a little towel next to me that I was like using to dry my forehead. I was sweating and I was very nervous. It's challenging stuff. And I think to anyone who's looking to start a studio, you have to be aware that it might end up that you'll have to do that stuff. You'll have to be super stressed and keep getting rejections, and just, you can't lose heart at the end of the day.
And then you grow through that though as well.
Yeah,
if
exactly. It becomes,
if you've done the pitch 100 times, you're not going to be as nervous the 100th
Precisely. It's like with coding, right? When you start coding, you don't know anything, and you're constantly, going online and trying to copy code from somewhere else. And then after you've had a few years, you at least know to which websites to go to copy the code down from. So you kind of get used to it. You manage to overcome that required energy to start pitching or coding or whatever. It's an acquired skill.
I know you had a couple false starts with publishers. You did get some investment. You've got some runway now. What's the roadmap looking now for getting Arto out there? When are we going to get our hands on it?
I still can't announce it because we finally signed with a publisher not long ago. And we've got everything organized, but we can't really announce it yet. We're waiting for a publisher to do that. But Arto will certainly be coming out within the next few months. I can say that much.
Okay.
And after after we release for PC, we obviously plan to support Arto. We already have a few extra bosses that we're working on, as well as some extra content that we will be pushing out. We also hope to port Arto to all the major platforms, such as the Switch and Xbox and PlayStation and all the usual suspects. And for the past year, I've been working with some friends and a very, very tiny team after hours on a second game. We'll be working.
Okay. I think we're all, super excited about Arto. But yeah, that was definitely my next question. Okay. So, Arto, it's amazing. I think it's something that moves games in a new direction in a really good way. So I think we're all going to be excited to see that come out. But there's Orion Games then. Now you've got this team together. You've got this experience of a first game out there. So yeah, do you got any hints for us on what that next idea might be?
So the next game is again a game that I think we all at Orion Games would really, really want to play. It's another 2D action adventure game with this time 2D, not 3D, with an emphasis again on exploration and combat. We have some very cool time traveling mechanics in our game, and in this next game, it's again rising up against some evil overlords and realizing that the world is not fully black and white throughout the progression of the story. So we really, really hope that the players will enjoy both the combat and this unique new world that we're creating. It has nothing to do with art except for some Easter eggs, but we also hope that players will have a lot of fun checking out how we can have a fun 2D combat system with time travel elements in it.
Interesting.
Ooh.
So that
time
should be
travel
also
is
a lot of fun.
a fun idea, a very fun
and
idea.
it's tough to get it so that it's fun.
And we hope that our mechanics will make players kind of think, oh, it's like a weird sort of fantasy Prince of Persia Sands of Time sort of game.
That's what I was just thinking of, Prince of Persia.
Nice.
The idea of turning back time and then making a different decision or doing a setup. That's a really interesting concept that was groundbreaking at the time when they did it, but not a lot of other people have been able to capitalize on.
Naturally not, but we're looking at games like, for example, Braid, and seeing, wow, that amazing 2D game really pushed the idea of time travel in video games. And so we want to do something similar to what Braid did, but again, push it in a different direction and give players something completely new and unexpected that hopefully will be a lot of fun for them to experience.
So this seems like now you're developing this idea of Orion Games being out there at kind of like pushing the boundaries. Now you're sort of pushing the boundaries with the art. Maybe you're going to push the boundaries a little bit with like the time travel mechanics. Is that kind of the vision then that you have moving forward? You want to sort of be out there pushing the boundaries, doing new, interesting, weird things?
That's our plan. Our philosophy is to give players something very, very fun, but also new in some way. And we obviously don't know what the future will hold, but yeah, it's art. But we do hope our vision, and I think I can speak for everyone really on our team, and also that's how I was pitching the game to our investors, our company. The idea of Orion Games is to contribute something new to the medium. Hopefully we'll be around for a very long time making fun games that people appreciate, but and have fun playing. But essentially what we hope to achieve is when a player sees the Orion logo, they knew they'll get something new, something a little bit different with a unique little spin on it. And they'll have a few hours that hopefully will be unforgettable.
I think that's inspiring, and that's the direction I would love to go. Things that are fun for me and things that are a little bit different. I think there are plenty of great games out there that are solid in a genre and another addition to an existing genre. And, as long as it's a solid game, it can be really fun. Oftentimes that's less risky for some of the bigger publishers. We're just going to make, we're going to make another battle royale, but we're going to make it really good. And okay, that's fine. People understand what that market is. It's easier to pitch to investors. Oh, it's a battle royale with these tweaks to it. It's much more difficult to pitch to investors and publishers. Here's something pretty unique, and you're going to have to take a risk. We're taking a risk, but we think there's something there. But this is where some of the most interesting stuff happens. So, congratulations to you all coming this far. I think Arto is a great example of thinking about that journey of having a solid idea, developing it over and iterating on it over and over and over until you've got it to something that you've hardened it into the diamond that it needs to be, and then having other people see that and be able to help come along on that journey. I know you've got I think you've got a Discord available so people can sort of jump in and
definitely. And
get connected.
If anyone watches this podcast and they want to ask more questions, just head on over to Discord. We always try to reply. I'm very active there, and I'm happy to talk to anyone about Arto or game dev or anything really. And hopefully people won't make the mistakes I made on my journey.
Well, I'm already in that Discord. I'm certainly going to stay connected and can't wait to see Arto come out. So as that comes out, maybe we'll catch back up in 6 months or so and see how the launch of Arto went and what's coming next for Orion Games. I think that would be a really fun conversation too. So
gladly, thank you. I
think with that, we will say thank you very much for coming on, and we hope to talk to you soon.
See you, Marcel.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This has been a New Overlords production. For more, please visit newoverlords.com for video, subscribe and feed links, and other ways to help the show.